Do you agree that Africa is treated unfairly by credit rating agencies?
I think that unfairly is a proper word. I think that the rating agencies have a role to play. If you take Ghana, Ghana has made history in terms of the duration of debt. So we have now access to long-term financing, and it was essential. When I arrived as Prime Minister of Benin, everything which was exigible from the debt market for the country was at a duration of 1 year. Okay, then Benin 2 months ago has issued a debt for 30 years. But the cost remains absolutely a cost reflecting an overestimation, over risk sort of essential vision of the market. We are overestimated in terms of risk. And many people are adverse to the African risk.
So what do you do about it?
I mean, I speak in front of specialists of managing the public debt, but we have to make clear that we are under-indebted if you consider the whole of the economy and not only the states. And we have to make very clear in the narrative on Africa, there is no default. Ghana will not default. Benin will not default.
Zambia has defaulted.
Yes, but when you add up Zambia, Zimbabwe, Eritrea, a certain number of fragile countries, it is less than 8% of the GDP of Africa. You cannot use, you will not use Cyprus or Greece to say it's absolutely absurd to have negative interest rates in France or Germany. So let's be clear, there are ways to cure the risk of default on a handful of countries. You can go on the secondary market and buy them back. All that, I hope, are, as we speak, dealt with in the summit. You need some technicalities, but more importantly, the narrative on the default risk of Africa is, as the minister said, only related to our Ghanaian or Beninese address. It's not the truth in our fundamentals.
It's not the truth, but those premiums are higher. And if a country like Ethiopia then defaults, then they'll become higher for everyone, including Benin and Ghana, right?
To say the truth, we go down. If you take the most recent issuing, you had interest rates a bit below, it was end of 2019, but you had interest rates a bit below the GDP growth rate, which starts to be virtuous. It's important that we do not pay more than the growth of our GDP in terms of interest on our debt. Then, if you are respecting that, you have a chance to have a virtuous circle. And the governance is very important. A country like Ghana has impressed the world in terms of progress in reforms and governance. And the African Union is now negotiating on the debt, the cost of debt, the duration of debt, the forgiveness of part of the debt, the creation of a secondary market, guarantees funds, and so on, collectively. What is interesting in the room today, in the summit, is that you have the President of the African Union, you have the special envoys, and the ministers have, coming from everywhere in Africa, a collective, the beginning of a collective management of the debt issue of the continent. This had never happened. So I think we could have some management progress. And last word, the diaspora is also important for this imbalance which has been evoked in between domestic savings and investment.
They send remittances home?
Yes.
Or is it because they have lobbying power in Washington and Paris?
I hope they develop lobbying power. And when you take some of the special envoys of the African Union, some have been head of Credit Suisse or have had international positions of influence. But more importantly, in 2020, we had an increase in remittances when in 2009, you had a major decrease. So you had solidarity from the diaspora to Africa. It's an important inflow of added savings. It's also important. You have not only the market and the direct investment flows. You have also our residents outside who are more and more important.
Marin Ferry, those remittances, economists say they're the sort of the most effective way to help development. Some say is that an overstatement? Those remittances, just to remind our viewers, which is people who live abroad sending money to their family.
Yeah, definitely. It is one of the most important financing sources, external financing sources for developing countries and low-income countries all over the world, and of course African countries in this specific topic. But this is not, I think we should not oppose remittances to other type of external financing, such as ODA, official development assistance, such as also borrowing to the external private sector, or for instance to also some other sources such as FDI. If the country needs some money to finance, for instance, infrastructures, remittances won't do that job, right? So we still need, the African countries and the low-income countries still need to have a wide access to various external financing sources in order to be able to invest in massive infrastructures, in order to invest in education programs, in health programs, in order to tackle a lot of issues that needs huge amount of financing.
So let's talk about that, because Lionel Zinsou mentioning African nations coming together at forums like this summit that's taking place in Paris. And just to give our viewers an idea, right now we talked about Zambia. It's defaulted. It's the only country in Africa that's defaulted since the pandemic. But there are others in distress, some of them big players like Ethiopia, Cameroon, Kenya. Ghana is well mentioned on the list by the International Monetary Fund. Before the crisis, the common obsession was how big debt was in comparison to what a country produces each year. In other words, what its GDP, debt to GDP ratio is. And there you see the numbers there that you saw a minute ago there were included countries that are doing fine, excuse me for saying it, like Japan or Italy, which are sound economically. So we're now starting to wonder if that debt to GDP ratio shouldn't be replaced by something else. For instance, and we see it here, debt services as a multiple of government health expenditure, just to give an example. In other words, this is how much Mozambique, which is number one on the list in Africa, pays in interest on debt it owes compared to how much it spends on healthcare. And it brings us back, Marin Ferry, to what Louis Bédouchat said at the outset. At the end of the day, this has to be about getting vaccines in citizens' arms. It has to be about shoring up the infrastructure and helping the educational system. You can't do it if you're just paying off debt, right?
No, definitely. Yes. This is
not even debt, sorry, excuse me, interest on debt.
Yes, this is a vicious circle. This is what we call the real burden effect, meaning that all these interests and the share of the capital that all the countries have to reimburse are crowding out the financing of necessary public expenditures. And if I may to go back to what Lionel Zinsou said and the other interveners have said, there is indeed this issue of why this debt is so expensive. Why are the risk premiums so high on those markets? And from my point of view, which is the academic one, and I'm looking at all this research paper, I can cite one paper, I think published 2 years ago, that shows basically that if we take all the characteristics of the developing countries, okay, and we compare developing countries to an African countries which are sharing the same similarities in terms of economic structure, public finance, institutional quality, the African countries is going to face a higher risk premium on the markets, holding everything else constant.
Why?
Because of maybe a stigma on these bond markets, maybe because also of the history of debt crisis in Africa, which has been pretty important in the early 80s and in the late 90s. So maybe there is this bad reputation that has nothing to do with what we observe currently in terms of GDP growth, in terms of institutional quality, because we have some countries which are pretty strong in terms of institutional quality and fiscal capacity that are still facing really high risk premium on international financial markets, which is not justified by the the economic fundamentals of this country. This is what Barry Eichengreen in the 80s called the original sin. And we can extend his concept to the double original sin, meaning that there is a risk premium which is not justified by the economic fundamentals of those countries.